Hey, what's going on everyone? It's Daniel with Daniel Blink Studios and welcome to our first Photoshop tutorial. And today's topic is going to be talking about Camera Raw. What is Camera Raw and how can Camera Raw help you with your projects, whether you're an architectural student, a graphic designer, or even a photographer? Stay tuned for this tutorial. First things first, I want to say if you like my outro, huge shout out to Video Copilot for making such a really nice and clear tutorial on how to do that effect. I definitely recommend you see their channel, especially if you're into After Effects and want to learn a lot of high and advanced editing techniques. Also, if you haven't seen my trailer, Voice for the Future, go in the description box below or click on the card icon, perhaps even after this tutorial, to make sure you watch that. And please leave a comment. Make sure you tell me what you think. I would love to hear from each and every one of you guys. So now, let's get to it. So Camera Raw in Photoshop is a processor that uses the metadata from both your camera and your images to hold information such as color, exposure, highlights, and much more. Camera Raw essentially is like a film negative. So if any of you use an SLR camera, which stands for single lens reflex camera, which essentially relates to film photography, you know what this is. As you're editing the photo, it still retains, the Camera Raw retains all the previous data and all the information in the photo. It's still there. So if you take a photo and let's say the photo was overexposed, you can still kind of bring back all the details that it's kind of like washed out, or you can even change the white balance, the tones and all these things, the hues, the saturations. So for myself personally, whenever I get a new camera, I always make sure my photo output is in RAW. And essentially RAW images really retain all this information even after you've taken the photo. So if something is washed out or if something is too dark, you can always find a way to bring back those details to look clean. So whenever I take photos, I always make sure that my camera setting, the output setting for the images that is set to RAW rather than JPEG, because JPEG is a compressed version of all that sort of detail in an image. So when you have a RAW image and you take it to Camera Raw, you have access to all that information that's within the photo, and you can edit it and kind of bring back all these things that might have been lost when you've taken the image. So let's get into it. So looking at my screen now, essentially there's two very well-known format for Camera Raw. If you look at the type section here, these were photos that were taken on a Canon camera, which has the CR2 file format. And these are a series of photos taken on a Nikon camera and it has an NEF format. These are primarily the cameras I've used personally, so I'm not too sure what other RAW format may be on other cameras. It could be something similar. You could just let me know in the description below. So for our example, we're going to work with these three photos and I'm going to just drag and drop it. There are many ways to activate Camera Raw. So when you drag a RAW image into Photoshop, it's automatically going to open Camera Raw. So these three photos were taken at a shoot last Halloween or a little bit before Halloween. Really wanted to do Miles Morales cosplay. So the reason why I chose these three images particularly, because I can really give you an example of how powerful Camera Raw is. And I'm going to just quickly show you what the final result is. This is how it looks on my personal Instagram, and it was a really interesting photo to edit. So essentially we have a lot of factors. We have, it's kind of dark, part of our photo is lit, and some things may seem like it's out of focus. This is not completely straight, and we see this similarly in the other photos, right? But the beauty about Camera Raw is that we can actually bring all these things back. What I'm going to do is not necessarily do a comprehensive edit to get the final result. I will do future videos to kind of show you how to properly take advantage of camera raw. So I'm just gonna quickly go over some of these things. Of course, here you have the zoom tool, which is zoom out, zoom in, zoom out. And if you hold Alt or Option on the Mac, you can kind of like reverse it, shift that. This is the panning tool, right? Pretty self-explanatory. And as we're going here, this is really interesting. So white balance. If we kind of look at the histogram, we can kind of just get an idea how these different tones, blacks, shadow, exposure, and whites are kind of shown in the photo, right? So essentially what the white balance picker does is if I click on an area as a sampler, this is basically my sampling tool, it's going to adjust the image to kind of match or kind of counteract or balance the color temperature of wherever I click, right? So if I click on an area which is, let's say, quote unquote cooler, because we know that cooler is towards this side, this kind of blue hue, and warmer is going this way on the slider. If we're looking here at the color temperature, it's better to actually set this up in your camera or kind of edit it manually edit the temperature and go through some other settings, because sometimes it could be a little bit off. For example, if I was to click on my mask, right? Or let's try, yeah, the red logo. You can see that it's very, very, very cool. So it begins to just make an inference on the entire image based on that area I click, right? And here's color sampler. If you want to get, let's say I want to know the RGB for this red logo, right? I click here and it gives me this, right? And you can also sample multiple colors, right? This is just very helpful if you need to, let's say, go over this area and kind of like paint or enhance the color. You have the RGB information. So let's just clear that for now, right? Now, next we have the target adjustment tool. What we have here is called a histogram. And essentially, if you were to click Alt on your keyboard, then click and slide it, it will adjust the histogram. Do you see how that changed, right? It's basically shifting all the whites, the exposure, the shadows, depending on where you slide it, to the left or to the right, you know, and it works the same way. Down is going to your left, and up is basically like going to your right. But this is kind of just like fast way to even out the shadows, the whites, and all these things, right? Let's say you have a photo and you just kind of want to quickly begin to brighten certain areas or all these things. This is a good tool. However, you do begin to lose a little bit of color, but that's nothing to worry about. We can show you how to bring the colors back. But for now, let's actually go back, right, to the original. This is your crop tool. Of course, it's a bit self-explanatory. You select the margin region, right? And if you want it to be a square, you just hold Shift on your keyboard and it's gonna keep it as a square. So basically a 1-to-1 ratio. Straightening tool, you find an edge in the image and it's going to align everything to that edge. For example, if I pick this edge, which is pretty horizontal, so basically this is horizontal, but let's say I was to, excuse me one second, let's say if I was to do something like that, it's going to line up this crop tool based on the angle which I drew that line. The transform tool is going to be a super important tool, especially when you have backgrounds or when you have elements that may not be too straight in an image. So let's pretend this was crooked, right? Essentially what I would do is, once I select the transform tool, right, I would have to find two edges that are not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have to be parallel, but imagine that it's supposed to be parallel, right? I'll click these two edges and it will automatically straighten the image to make these two edges parallel. And there's other ways to mitigate that. You can do it more manually by tilting the photo. This is also going to require a crop, right? Kind of like tilt it, and let's say I rotate that a little bit. I want to get this straight, right? Distort it just a little bit here and there. And there are some ways you can take advantage of that. So this is something you can play around with. see what works. And similarly, scale, and you have aspect, which stretches the image a little bit, right? In case sometimes when you take a photo, sometimes the camera may glitch. This is more common on phone cameras, however, and your image may be compressed. You can try to like stretch it out to even it out. So this is where you will find a lot of these transformation tools, and this is like an automatic application, right? And each of these give you guidelines to how the transformation is going to work. Here is, you're basically disabling it, so you have like all the manual control. Here, if you click automatic, basically the program is going to try to determine that for you. So if you click here, it's only regarding level correction, and if you hover over these icons, they're going to give you more detail for what it's about, right? This is only for your vertical perspective correction. So even though let's say try to play with the horizontal one, right, it's really focused on that. Spot removal is basically your healing brush. So if you had any of your images had blemishes, I hit, by the way, Alt and my scroll key to zoom in, which would be Option on the Mac. You could begin to like heal certain areas, right? If you had blemishes, you kind of adjust the size of your brush, and to adjust the size of your brush, you right click and hit Alt on the PC, Option on the Mac, and then you can adjust your brush that way, your feather, your intensity, like how much of that area you want to change with the opacity here. And here's red eye removal. You know, sometimes when you use flash and it's in the dark, and that's going to help correct that. So now the adjustment brush is actually one of my favorite tools. So what the adjustment brush allows me to do is to select a specific area in the photo, and I can make changes to that area in regards to exposure, contrast, or any of these settings. And I'll demonstrate. So I just have this exposure that happens to be 3.7, and let's say I kind of like made that like 50 or 2.5. I can just paint away at this area, and the exposure will only change here. So basically, this is just a great way to kind of, let's say under the face is a little bit dark, but you don't want to increase the overall exposure or the overall contrast or anything like that, because it's going to affect everything in your composition. You just take an adjustment brush, you change the settings, and you can just paint away, right? And every time you want to do a new adjustment brush, you click new, right? Instead of add, you click new, and I can adjust the settings, right? Because let's say here doesn't require as much exposure, and you just paint away in that area accordingly. So it's such a great tool. And the next three tools work similarly. Graduated filter takes all the settings, and similar to a gradient, it applies it likewise, right? So you have a change in exposure and all these settings that I've changed here, but as a filter, right? So what happens here is that the green areas where the changes are prominent, and it begins to fade out the higher you go. Sometimes this is just a quick solution. Maybe you don't really need a huge edit. Maybe it's kind of just more of a gradient you need to apply. And likewise, it works here for this radial filter, but except everything outside the radial is what's going to be affected, right? So everything in here is going to have its previous exposure. Everything outside the radial will be affected by these settings, and it just gradually fades out, similar to the gradual filter. And here is just where you can adjust some settings, but this I'm not going to get too much into this tutorial because it's not necessary to know in order for you to really take advantage of Camera Raw. Here we have just your rotate tool, right? And let's say you accidentally mark your image for delete, right? So basically all you have to do is click this button to undo it, and it won't be sent to the trash once you hit done on editing all your Camera Raw images. So getting a little bit into these settings is similar principles. Exposure essentially is how much light, like whether it's natural light or artificial light, is coming in through your lens and hitting the sensor, right? So increasing the exposure brightens the image, because essentially it's like more light is coming into your sensor. And when you're shooting with raw images, all this information is retained. So you can change the exposure without making the image look too grainy or too distorted. But don't go too crazy on the exposure. This is why we have other settings to begin to sort of balance it out. Contrast is the difference between lights and dark, right? So if you increase the contrast, you're kind of increasing the differences or the intensity between the light and dark, which kind of gives you this sort of effect if I was to turn it all the way up. Highlights kind of focuses on areas that are white or illuminated, I should say, and it emphasizes on that illumination and makes it brighter. Shadows are area that's kind of dark as a result of something, let's say, covering it, and when you begin to open the shadow, it kind of reduces that intensity, that dark intensity, and kind of washes it out a little bit, thus making the image feel lighter. And likewise, that's the same principle that's going to apply for blacks, right? It's reducing but it's basically taking areas of the image that's dark and reducing the dark tones and making the dark tones a little bit lighter. And also here, whites, similar to highlights, except it's focused more on white colors. It emphasize, or lighter colors I should say, and it emphasizes those colors and make it a lot brighter. Clarity is essentially sharpening your image, right? It's kind of a quick tool. Don't go too crazy on it because it kind of has this stylized effect when you increase it too much. Dehaze is perfect for humid environments. So when you're shooting something, right, let's say it's very humid outside, it reduces the humidity in the image, thus making the image look a little bit sharper and more defined, right? And I'll show you the opposite, decreasing dehaze. You see it gets a little bit foggy. So vibrance is basically color intensity. Increasing the vibrance make the colors in the image more intense. If you don't want all your colors to be more intense but certain colors, stay tuned. I'm going to show you how to do that in a moment. And saturation focuses on different hues and also similar to vibrance, making those colors pop out a lot more. So this is pretty much what you need to know for your basics tab. You have your color temperature, you have your tint, right? Color temperature, which is more about kind of changing the tone of the image. You can bring it closer to the warm tones of the sun, right? Like the sun during a sunset, for example, by increasing the color temperature. Decreasing the color temperature is more like artificial light or very strong light during noonday, for example. Now, going to the next tab, we're looking at curves, right? Curves is essentially based on your histogram. You can change the intensity of the light areas and you can change the intensity of the dark areas, right? So we're not going to play too much with it, just kind of introduce that a little bit and kind of show you what that's like, right? And if you're wondering what these blue areas, these are areas that are so dark and my histogram is picking it up. That means we need to make these areas just a little bit lighter. But let's say I wanted to kind of bring down the tones in this image a little darker. What I can do is go back here, open up the shadows just a bit, right? Let's kind of make that, let's say 45, right? So open this up by 30, right? And boom, we begin to resolve it. But this is just an example. Of course, you wouldn't want any area of your photos to be too dark, right? But this is just one way to kind of like play around with that, right? There's many ways to do it. You could kind of adjust those things. Now, sharpening is, of course, sharpening the details in your image. You can make certain details a little bit sharper, right? Let's say if I was to put this all the way up, the problem is it's going to get very noisy. So let's say an area in the photo was very out of focus and I need to increase the sharpening. What I would end up doing now is also trying to increase the luminance. So what this is noise reduction. So you can kind of see the difference. Look, it's a little bit grainy. When I increase the luminance, it starts to get rid of that, right? And you can also toggle between these settings to kind of adjust the intensity of the luminance, right? right? And you can also look at some of the color details. You want the color to pop a little bit more, right? How much detail do you want to be retained? And also how smooth you want it to be, because sometimes when you kind of make colors pop in certain areas, it begins to look a little bit strange and distorted. So now looking here, the image is already starting to look better, and these are just simple basic edits that we're doing. So if you want to cycle between before and after, come to this icon in the bottom corner of your screen, click it here, and you could see a before and after, right? We toggle again, we can see it like this, right? Before, after. And you can even try to get it side by side. Perfect. Now we can kind of see it before and after. So it's already starting to look better just by going through some of these things. And these are things you can use not just for your photography, but even graphic design. There could be just certain parts of your image that are a little bit dark, and you could give it a little bit of punch. Because the beauty of Camera Raw is that although it's made for raw images, you can also take advantage of using Camera Raw for JPEGs. But in order to open JPEGs in Camera Raw, you have to do it within Photoshop, and I'm going to show you that in a short while. Next tab is color adjustments. So basically what these things are is kind of focusing on specific colors. So what I can do is increase the reds in the image, and you can see now the reds are popping a lot more, right? Here I could change like anything that has like an orange hue, and here anything with a yellow hue. And likewise, that's the principle, to make certain colors pop a little bit. And luminance, making those colors glow. So essentially it will make my reds appear lighter, right? Or if I kind of make it, dim it out, right, reduce the luminance, it's going to appear to be darker. And it's a similar principle for each of these tones. I'm focusing on red because red is prominent in some of these accents in the suit, right? And I can even do pink in Gwen's suit. A little bit of purple. Okay, very nice so far. And hue essentially is kind of like just adjusting the tones to kind of make it more of, let's say, like a pink, right? Or make it maybe a different shade of red. And similar for each tone, you can adjust the orange and kind of like adjust it to kind of give it like a different feel, right? Let's say I'm interested in this, I could kind of just make the city skyline and make the orange more of a darker orange to kind of give it this look. Next we have tone splitting, and essentially this is kind of focusing on your highlights, and then you can kind of adjust the colors of this, right? I don't have too much highlights, but we have a little bit on Gwen, and we can begin to observe it maybe slightly. Or maybe the highlights are not intense enough to observe this, unfortunately. Then saturation, you can oversaturate the colors that are present in your image, but this, use it with caution. Only if you have like a prominent color which you think can overall be a little bit deeper. For example, let's say I want to make it, let's say, a little bit deeper. I can adjust this, but be mindful with how much you adjust it, right? And of course, the shadows is more about kind of either brightening the shadows or kind of making the shadows darker. And in here, we can begin to change like the hues of the shadows, likewise with the highlights. So I could saturate my shadows and give it like these different colors. So now we have lens correction. So unless you're shooting at your camera's normal lens, and the normal lens of the camera essentially varies on the size of your sensor. So depending on your sensor, your camera's normal lens may be a little bit different, right? Mine, for example, is about 28 point something, close to 30 millimeters. That's my camera's normal lens. And essentially what the normal lens of a camera is it's basically how close a camera can get to how the human eye perceives images, right? So anything lower than the normal lens is considered to be a wide angle lens. Anything that's higher than that will be considered a telephoto lens. So what this does is when you shoot as with a wide lens or with a telephoto lens, sometimes what you may have is barreling in the image. So first things first, whenever I start editing my photos, I usually start with this step, profile corrections, right? So this, as you can see, gets rid of any barreling. And because the image is essentially flat now, the colors are more evenly distributed, so it makes it essentially appear to be lighter, right? And chromatic aberration, this is not a good example because this is at night, but chromatic aberration sometimes, especially during the daytime when there's a spectrum of colors in the image, basically a camera doesn't read it too well. So it's like you have like these colorful hazy lines in your images, but essentially what this does is that the program itself can automatically remove chromatic aberrations. So sometimes if you're shooting in the daytime, it might not be too visible right off the bat, but I always like to make sure this is checked just in case. And then here it gives you information of what camera you shot with, the lens that was being used, the profile, and all these things. Also, special shout out to Stevenson for taking these wonderful photos for me and Kim. And here essentially what it is that, let's say you applied your profile correction, but sometimes the program doesn't always do it perfectly. So perhaps you might have to do a little bit more manual adjustment. I would say that it really depends on your image, and for me, the enable profile correction did a really good job of fixing the barreling of my images. Then again, we had a pretty good telephotic lens, so there's a little bit less barreling in telephotic images than there is in wider images. And here vignetting is about either darkening the edges of your image with a dark vignette as shown here, or lightening it up, right, by sliding it to either the right or to the left. So for this image, what's more appropriate for me is using a sort of a darker vignette just to kind of fit the overall tone of this image. And I feel like maybe a 40 would be pretty good. Yeah. And essentially what the grain is to add grain to your images, which I'm not going to use personally on this image because it's already shot at night and I want to get rid of grains. But just to demonstrate, you can add grain, you can affect the size of the grain, and you can even kind of adjust the texture of it. Certain photos, if you're trying to get that grainy effect, make it maybe like an old image, you can use that for it. Vignetting is basically similar to the previous vignetting that we saw, but basically a little bit stronger. So what this does is really darken the edges or really lighten the edges, right? And midpoint kind of adjusts what the radius of this is. This is more about the shape, and this is kind of like fading it out, like if you want like a sharp edge or more of a feathered edge, right? And highlights is kind of really looking at highlights, if you have like let's say a darker vignette, really kind of like look at bringing back some of these colors to your images. Yeah, let's see, like that, right? But we're gonna just leave this at 0 because we're not going to use that. Now, similar to what was shown previously as well, this is more about changing the tints in your shadows or focusing on the tints of your primary colors in your images, either boosting the hue or saturation of those hues. Like if I was to make it a little bit more orange, I could increase the intensity of the orange, or a little bit more green, I can increase the intensity of the green. And some of these presets are default sort of like filters and settings within Camera Raw. If you just want to do something quick, you're not too interested in all this editing, you know, maybe this is complicated, which it's, or maybe you don't have time, you can find the right preset that matches your image and you can just overlay it. These are really good for black and white images, and you can just go through this, see what interests you. You can also always apply one of these presets and then apply some of your edits and maybe go from there. Maybe that's like a baseline for you. And that's pretty much it for Camera Raw. So once you finish editing your image on Camera Raw, the most important thing to do is to save the image. So when you save the image, it's going to save a copy of the image. You have the option of making it a JPEG, right? And choosing the destination. And you can also pick the file extension. So you could save it as a Photoshop file if you want to just go directly to Photoshop, or a JPEG if you're satisfied with the overall results. And then your destination, of course, you just hit save, right? I'm not going to save this, but just to demonstrate, if you hit open image, it's going to open it directly in Photoshop so that you can actually see, so you can actually continue doing some of these edits, right? And when you hit done, it's basically saying you're finished your editing. It's not going to really do anything after. It's just going to save your settings as another file extension. And basically, the nice thing about this is that when you edit a raw image, it does not destroy, or it's not destructive to the original raw image. So when you go to your file directory, you should still be able to see So when we go to our file directory, you might see something like this, right? You're still able to see the raw image, right? This is just for an example, right? And then here, this XMP file is actually all the data of the changes you made on Camera Raw. So if you want to just revisit this, you just highlight both and you import both of them to Camera Raw, and then you can actually be able to view that. You can re-edit your photos, or let's say you don't like any of your edits, just open the original raw file and you're going to basically start from scratch. So that's it for this tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This is just kind of more of a basic run through. I know it's pretty long, so if you watched this to the end, thank you for sticking around. I hope you learned something. If you like this video, don't forget to leave a like, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Is there more questions that maybe you have regarding Camera Raw? Is there something you want me to go over more in depth on? So the next video is going to be more so showing you the workflow between Camera Raw and going within Photoshop. If you haven't already, don't forget to check out the trailer for Voice for the Future. Link is in the description below. Please drop a comment. Let me know what you think about the project. I want to hear everyone's voices regarding this. So see you guys in the next video.